Okay, so we're going to talk about human rights and legal rights. So this is for the assignment, human rights and human wrongs. So hopefully you've done your research on all the different pieces of legislation that was on the sheet. So hopefully me going through this should be pretty quick. So the two underlying principles we've got, so we have the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. All right. So the idea is that these were brought about at the end of the Second World War to try and bring some sense of normality to the world and try and stop anything that had happened during the Second World War from happening again. So they have fundamental principles, right to life, right to marriage, etc. You can look them up, all the different articles on there. And the idea is that they are there to try and make the world a better place. Now, as we've discussed, they aren't legally binding because they are not a piece of legislation as such. They are not legally binding, especially in this country. Because we are in Europe, for the meantime anyway, if you feel that the UK government is not taking your human rights seriously, you can actually take it to the European Court on human rights as well, and they can have a wider say in it. But obviously with Brexit looming, this may well change in the future, so we may only have the Human Rights Act to protect us. As we said, there might be some issues with it. So for example, there's one in there about the freedom to practice whatever religion you are. However, there are certain countries around the world where that is very difficult to do, and these come into direct contravention with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also to do with how women are treated, etc. So some countries around the world do not subscribe to Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which again can cause some issues, and we're well aware of the phrase human rights abuses that are taken around the world, etc. So you can have a look at some of those online. Right, next one for us is the Geneva Convention. So this is to do with times of war and how people should be treated in times of war. So the argument being that even though we are in a conflict, that there should be some rules if we are declaring war on each other. All right, so these are thinking about what happens to someone that can no longer participate in active conflict. So if someone is wounded, how should they be treated by the other side? What conditions should they be held under, etc. It looks a bit like torture as well. Should people be tortured? Which goes back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that torture not a good thing. And we can have a massive, great, long discussion about whether torture is appropriate at another time. It also thinks about how civilians should be treated during times of war. So again, we can look at horrible things that have happened in times of conflict where people in the military have committed atrocities against members of the public, civilians, by murdering them, raping them, all manner of types of horribleness. All right. So again, they're only used during conflict, armed conflicts, etc. So there was a notable case in the UK in 2011 in Helmand province in Afghanistan, where there were 3 Royal Marines and there was a wounded Taliban soldier, and one of the Royal Marines basically shot the guy dead, and there was a big court case about it. If you just Google Marine A, I'll try and put a link up onto Moodle, you can read up about the story, and it brings up a very tricky discussion about what would have happened in the opposite situation. So if it had been 3 Taliban soldiers and there was a Royal Marine that had been captured, what would they have done to the Royal Marine, etc. But again, we have to follow these particular rules because surely we should be better than everyone else. So bringing it on to the UK legislation. So we have the Human Rights Act 1998. So the idea being is that this is our piece of legislation. If you feel that your human rights are being abused or impeded upon or broken, then you basically can hold that person, that organisation, whoever you feel is doing that, in a court of law. So they follow on pretty closely to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So for example, the right to life, not being tortured, slavery, have your right to freedom, right to a fair trial, freedom of thought, protest, privacy, all these kinds of things. All right, and as it says, passed in 1988 allows you to defend your rights in a court of law, treat everyone with fairness, dignity and respect. So this is the main piece of legislation in the United Kingdom that protects our human rights. So you can have a look at all of the different aspects of that, and then think about the public services. Does it protect everybody? And as we discussed, unfortunately, everybody has the same human rights. So even if you're a prisoner in a prison, you still have, although modified to some degree, the same rights as you and I both have. And this can be a bone of contention with people. This can cause arguments and debates, because some people feel, well, if you're a prisoner, then you don't deserve any rights. But as we've discussed, if you take them away, you start imposing limits on human rights, then that is a slippery slope that we don't really necessarily want to go down. All right, so let's now look at some other pieces of legislation. So we have PACE, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. So the idea is this outlines the powers that the police have. Some of you might have looked at it in the government and policies assignment when you're looking at pieces of legislation and effects on the public services. So the idea is these are the powers that the police have, where they can use them, and we have these what are called the codes of practice. So for example, stop and search, searching premises or seizure of property, detention and question of persons, how people identify themselves, audio recordings, visual recordings, statutory powers of arrest, and detention and treatment of persons. All right, terrorism effects. So the idea is that the police have powers, but how proportionate are those powers? Do they have enough power? Do they have too much power? What can they do? What can't they do? If you are arrested, for an example, what rights do you have? What can the police do to you? What they can't do to you? For those of you wanting to join the police service as a police officer, what rights do you have against members of the public? Can you just stop and search anyone? Can you arrest anyone? Can you record anybody at a police station, etc.? So these are really important, and again, you can look these up and sort of go through them, and obviously those of you going into the public services, especially the police service, will need to know these inside and out. Now obviously they do come in conflict with human rights, because everyone has the right to liberty, but if you commit a crime, then we're going to take that away from you, we're going to arrest you, we're going to detain you. So this is where the conflict comes, and this is why policing and human rights is a very, very tricky area. And again, there's been notable cases. Right at the moment, there's the police have emergency powers to break up gatherings, public gatherings. Some people think they're being too heavy-handed, some people think they're not being strict enough. So it's a very tricky time and a very trying time, and also for the police service, something they've not had to deal with previously, so quite tricky for them. Alright, so on the bottom of the sheet there was lots and lots of legislation, Equal Pay Act, Sex Discrimination Act, Disability Act, etc. These were all put together into the Equality Act. So the idea was to bring everything together under one piece of legislation, so it was a lot easier to determine whether someone was being discriminated against. So the idea being is, under the Equality Act we have what we call a set of protected characteristics. And because it's again a piece of legislation, it tells us it's against the law. So if we discriminate against people with these protected characteristics, and we know what discrimination means because we've done it in our terminology, and we have protected characteristics. So the list is, age and disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnerships, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. So these are protected. So if it doesn't fall under that, then unfortunately it's not protected under the Equality Act 2010. So what that means is, well, we can't discriminate against somebody because they're young. We can't discriminate against them because they're old, for example. We can't discriminate against someone because of their race or their religion or their sex. So for example, that's why we don't have the Equal Pay Act, because it's now covered under the Equality Act. We don't have the Race Relations Act, because that's now covered under the Equality Act. We don't have the Disability Act, again. So these are the protected characteristics. If it doesn't fall underneath that, then unfortunately it's not protected by the Equality Act. There was a guy who was attempting to make veganism a protected characteristic because he felt he was being discriminated against because of his belief. He wanted to put that as a belief, took it to court, and for whatever reason it was not added to the list. Okay. Now the idea being is, under the Equality Act you can force an organisation or someone to make reasonable adjustments So, for example, if you have a disability, then you might want to have a ramp installed or be able to work from home. At the minute, we are all making reasonable adjustments because we are all having to work from home, for example. Yeah, if someone has a particular religion or a belief, can we make reasonable adjustments in their work to allow them to still practice their religion and belief? Do they need to go off and pray? Can we provide them with a prayer room? At Quals, yeah, we do have a prayer room where people can go in order to pray at certain times of the day. For example, we can't discriminate against someone because of their gender, all right? So we can make reasonable adjustments. Okay, next one is the Freedom of Information Act. So the idea being with this is that we as members of the public can get access to information that is held by the government or other public organisations. So the idea being is because public services are funded by us, that we should be able to have access to information that's held about us or information that the public services or the government holds. So, for example, the equality data that we've looked at, or we are going to look at in the next assignment, that we have the freedom to see that. What is the equality and diversity data for particular public services? We might be able to look at how much people get paid in certain public organisations. All right, but it doesn't cover everything. Obviously, there are restrictions that we can't see for national security or if it contravenes people's privacy, etc. So the way that we do it is we create a Freedom of Information request, we send that off, that gets looked at and someone determines whether or not that information can be given out freely or not under the Freedom of Information Act. Sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. I mean, it can't, again, as I say, if it then goes into contravention of people's privacy, or if it's not in the public interest, or if it goes against national security, etc. Okay, Data Protection Act. So we know that companies hold a huge amount of data about us. So, for example, the college holds a huge amount of data about you. Yeah, your name, your date of birth, where you live, your telephone number, your email address, any issues, etc. So the idea with this legislation is that any information that's held about you is held responsibly. So, for example, all the information that we have about you, no one can get to that without going through a password system. So it's on our staff intranet, you need a staff login to be able to see that. No one can just access your personal identity or your personal records, etc. It also looks at how much information organisations hold about you. So, for example, what do they need to know about you? Yeah, how much information do they need to know about you? And how is that information used? All right. So we are well aware at the moment of targeted Facebook ads or the amount of personal information that people give out on social media, etc., that then gets sold on to companies that then use that for whatever it is, yeah, PPI calls or target advertising, etc. So the reason that the Data Protection Act has been updated was to do with GDPR. All right, so this was the General Data Protection Regulation, which came from the EU, which the idea was that companies need to tell you what information they hold about you and why they are holding that information. There is some great documentaries on Netflix that show you the amount of information that companies have about you. There's a company called Cambridge Analytica that got its information from Facebook, and there's a lot of allegations this was used in elections to get certain political parties into power, and there were a lot of people saying that they were breaching your data protection. So just as a very brief example, if you ever do a stupid quiz on Facebook or online and you publish your results to your social media, you are giving that company all of the answers that you have put and access to your profiles. So you've got to be very careful what it's doing. And you can, again, take companies to court if you feel that they are not holding your data securely. You can ask to see the data that they hold about you and to see if it is being held securely. So every student has a student file. If you want to see your student file, you just go and you can make a request and we can show you everything that is held on file about you. Now, the Data Protection Act brings up something that's happened more recently, is the right to be forgotten. So you can do a Google search for this, all right, and you can look at some articles and stuff about that. But the idea being is, like, if you search something on Google, how far back can you go and look into someone's past? How far back does someone's privacy extend? If someone was convicted of a crime when they were 12, can that still be found on Google, for example? Yeah, is there things where you can get erased from the internet? All right, and as we keep saying to you, anything you put up on the internet could be there for a long while, and it's very difficult to get it taken down. So there you go. All right, so those are the human rights and legal rights you're going to need to talk about in your assignment. So for each one, a brief description about what it does and what it protects, please.